I noticed we have the blue lights up back here, and I wanted them to turn it blood red, but apparently we don't have that color there. So, since I'm the one who came up with this term, negative world, it's up to me to tell you what it is. And so that's what my first talk is basically going to be today. And we used to talk about the culture war, or this conflict between the church and secular society. Well, today it seems like there's a culture war, but the culture war is actually inside of the evangelical church itself. We're seeing a lot of conflict, a lot of acrimony, and a lot of realignment. So we'll have this group of evangelicals over here point their fingers at this group over here and say, look at them, they voted for Trump. How dare they? How horrible is that? And then you have this group of evangelicals over here pointing their finger over here and say they're going woke. They're abandoning traditional teachings on sexuality, whatever it may be. And there's all this conflict, and if you're on Twitter, then you see it every day. We also see that people like David French, who you would have classified as a hardcore culture war type, actually spends most of his time now criticizing conservative evangelicals. Russell Moore, who actually ran a major entity or agency in the Southern Baptist Convention, left to join the staff of a church that baptizes babies. Somebody needs to find out what's going on there. And Owen Strachan, who was a Southern Baptist seminary professor, he left a very nice established seminary to go be the provost of a startup seminary. So people are moving around, alliances are changing, and there's conflict. And what's causing this? What's going on? And what is happening is that there has been a fundamental shift in society into what I call the negative world that is putting tremendous new pressure and different forms of pressure on the evangelical church, which is producing deformation of existing strategies, sort of conflict and realignment, similar to what we see happening in conservative politics. So if you roll the clock back to the 1950s, this was probably the high watermark of Christianity in America. About half of all adults attended church every Sunday in the 1950s. More than that were members. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money. We were adding "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. We had a sort of Protestant establishment in America at that time. There was even prayer in the public schools. And while it may not have been an especially devout era, perhaps, there was a sort of soft institutionalization of a sort of generic Protestantism that was in the process of absorbing Catholics and Jews into that as well. And so Christianity was held in esteem and honor in the country. But starting in the 1960s, and you could probably date it to the Kennedy assassination. I don't think the Kennedy assassination per se had anything to do with it, but somewhere around that date, things started to go the wrong direction for Christianity. Christianity went into a period of decline in America starting around 1964, one that continues all the way forward to the present day. And this period of decline from 64 to the present, I divide into three different eras or worlds that I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative worlds. These names refer to how society as a whole views Christianity. We're used to talking about how the church views culture. So there's a very famous book by H. Richard Niebuhr called Christ and Culture. It's all the different ways that different Christian people have attempted over the years to reconcile Christ and culture. Well, this is a little bit the opposite. This is how the culture views Christianity. So in the positive world, which lasted from 1964 to 1994, Christianity is in decline, church attendance is declining, the metaphysical and moral claims of Christianity are being called into question. Nevertheless, Christianity is still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man, people want to vote for you. It helps you get a job, that sort of thing. And Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society. Around 1994, we hit a tipping point in which Christianity was no longer viewed positively, but it wasn't really yet viewed negatively either. it was sort of seen as a sort of socially neutral attribute, hence this is the neutral world that lasted from around 1994 to 2014. And then in the neutral world, Christianity is essentially one lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic, multicultural society. And in this era, Christian moral norms held a sort of residual force. But around 2014, we hit a second tipping point and entered what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, society as a whole, elite culture, now views Christianity negatively. Being known as a devout, Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in Silicon Valley today. Quite the opposite, in fact. Additionally, Christian morality is expressly repudiated by society and is even viewed as a threat to the new emerging moral order. I like to illustrate the difference between these worlds using 3 different presidential sex scandals. In the positive world, you can go back to 1987. Colorado Senator Gary Hart was a leading contender for the Democratic nomination for president the next year. The Miami Herald reported that a young woman had stayed overnight in his townhouse in Washington, D.C., and he was forced to drop out of the race. Just the appearance of potentially having had an affair disqualified him from running. Fast forward to the neutral world, 1998, the Drudge Report breaks the news that Bill Clinton has been having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. This caused a massive scandal. Bill Clinton was badly damaged by it. It probably cost Al Gore the election in 2000. And yet the Democrats rallied around him, and he survived. And people said, look, his personal behavior, however deplorable, is not relevant to his public performance in office. So it damaged him, but he survived it. In the negative world, fast forward to October 2016, NBC News has been sitting on this Access Hollywood tape of Trump making all these statements about women, and they're just ready to drop their October surprise. They can't wait to take Trump down with this tape. They release it, and it turns out to be a 48-hour blip of a scandal, and he goes on to win the election a couple weeks later. So in the negative world, these sex scandals basically don't matter at all. And I think there's a sort of irony, maybe a delicious irony in a sense, that the very people who tore down and rejected the Christian moral system are the ones who made it possible for someone like Donald Trump to become president. If we weren't in the negative world, Donald Trump would never have been considered a serious candidate for president due to his personal behaviors. But in this negative world, it didn't matter anymore. And of course, the other irony is that the people who voted for Trump are the people who would have previously been most strident that character and leaders matter. So I think it's kind of interesting that the profound consequences this negative world has had for our society. Now, why did I pick these dates? And again, picking dates for transitions in history is always somewhat impressionistic. I picked 2014 as the neutral to negative transition because this was 1 year before the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision that essentially institutionalized Christianity's new status in society. 2014 is also when people, including Democratic pundits like Matthew Iglesias, started talking about what they called the Great Awakening. The use of phrases like white supremacy or structural racism just exploded in the major media. Also, 2013 is when New York University professor Jonathan Haidt, a lot of people follow Jonathan Haidt, he started saying, man, I noticed something is up with my students. Crazy things are happening on campus. So clearly something happened during Obama's second term that represented a major social rupture in the country. Now, the transition from positive to neutral is a little less precise. I think you could make an argument for 1989, which is when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, because that end of the Cold War really was critical to ending the positive world, because Christianity was a key part of essentially the moral arsenal that America used in its battle against the Soviet Union, which was this sort of atheist, godless communist state that repressed religion like the Catholic Church in Poland. And that's why back in the 50s we were adding, in God we trust through our money, adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. We're putting these symbols of Christianity into the center of American culture as part of the Cold War. And so once the Cold War ended, that sort of got rid of a bulwark that sort of Christianity had. I picked 1994 for a few reasons, though. One is it's the year Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York, and the cities came back. Think about the implications of the urban renaissance, the urban resurgence. Certainly it's affected Portland, Seattle, places like that. In the 70s, there was a famous billboard in Seattle, "Will the last one leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" People thought cities were going down the tubes. The rebirth of the cities really had a profound influence, both in the culture and especially in the church, as I'll talk about in a bit. 94 was also the year of the Republican Revolution, when Newt Gingrich and the House Republicans took over the House of Representatives, the contract with America. That was a watershed moment. It really represented the peak of probably early 90s populism, and probably also the peak of the religious right influence within the Republican Party. So I picked 94, but again, if you want to pick a slightly different date, be my guest. Now, how did evangelicals respond to this changing landscape of the three worlds in the period since, say, 1964? Well, they responded with three characteristic ministry strategies that are culture war, seeker sensitivity, and cultural engagement. So the culture war strategy, or what we might think of as the religious right, emerged in the 1970s and of course continues with us today. It's probably the best known of these movements. And I think the very name of the leading organization we associate with the culture war, Moral Majority, speaks to the positive world. You could only call something the moral majority in an era when it was at least plausible to make that claim. Now, it might not have been true even then, but much like Richard Nixon's silent majority, it was at least a plausible claim. And so the religious right, again, emerged in the 1970s out of this movement that was called the New Right at the time. And you might be saying, well, I'm reading a lot about the New Right now, in which I just always like to tell people there's nothing older than the New Right. There's always a new right coming along. This is probably the most famous one. It was a big 70s and 80s insurgency. And what they basically did was they saw that the sexual revolution was happening, Roe versus Wade, prayer kicked out of schools. They said, things are going the wrong way, godlessness is on the rise, and we're going to fight back. So we're going to mobilize politically in order to take back the country from the left. And, up until the 1970s and even into the early 1980s, evangelicals had predominantly been Democrats. The first evangelical president was Jimmy Carter. And Newsweek magazine named 1976 the year of the evangelical because that was the year that he won. As late as 1983, the sociologist James Davison Hunter found that a plurality of evangelicals remained Democrats. But under the leadership of people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, this group of people realigned into the Republican Party in the mid-'80s and became, and I would argue remains, the largest and most important voting bloc in the Republican Party. And again, the culture warriors, as their name implies, they took a highly combative and oppositional stance versus this emerging culture. They were looking for a fight. And it's also notable that the people we associate with the culture war movement are people who are sort of located far away from the major citadels of culture in America. They tended to be from backwaters, a lot of them. And they reach their followers mostly through their own platforms, like direct mail or paid for UHF TV shows like the 700 Club. And this gave them a sort of marketing-driven televangelist style that we all know. Although later in the 80s, as these groups became politically active, groups like the Christian Coalition drew in big donor money. But originally it was sort of donations from the flock. And so the major culture war figures, people you may have heard of, Jerry Falwell of Moral Majority, who was where? Lynchburg, Virginia, not a big city in kind of Western Virginia. Pat Robertson of the Christian Broadcasting Network in Virginia Beach, again, not a major cultural center. James Dobson of Focus on the Family. I'm not sure exactly where he originally started, but Focus on the Family is in Colorado Springs today. The fact that there are a lot of Christian orgs in Colorado Springs, like again, another kind of smaller city, which at that time, Colorado was not really all that much in terms of growth. So that kind of gives you a sense of who was there. A second strategy of the positive world was seeker sensitivity, which again was also pioneered in the 1970s by people like Bill Hybels of Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, or Rick Warren of Saddleback Church down in Orange County. And basically these are people, what happened with them was they saw that church attendance was in decline, and they said, how are we going to get people to start going to church? How are we going to reach people for Christ? And so, as the story goes, Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago, knocking on doors, and first question he'd ask is, do you go to church? And if the answer is yes, interview's over. If the answer is no, he's like, well, why do you go to church? Why don't you go to church? And then people would give all the list of reasons why they didn't go to church. He says, I'm going to design a church that these people want to go to. So he kind of shed many of the denominational distinctives, traditions, etc. He adopted this sort of informality in liturgy and dress from the Jesus movement, which was a Christian expression of the counterculture. Contemporary Christian music was brought in. And, there was also a sort of a therapeutic style of preaching. What I mean by that is there's a lot of self-help. Today you might hear a sermon on here's how you manage your social media or something like that. The Christian psychologist Henry Cloud, who some of you may know because he wrote or co-wrote many Christian books, he's actually been a regular speaker, or at least one point was a regular speaker at Willow Creek. They're getting very approachable, very non-threatening, not combative. And this group is, again, still with us today, and you can think of this as basically the non-denominational suburban megachurch that we kind of mostly know. And I think there's a couple notable things about this that talk about the positive world. First, just the term seeker sensitive. I don't know when that term was invented. I didn't invent it, but people talk about seeker sensitivity. Just the very name assumes a lot of people are seeking, right? So it's still positive in the sense that people are looking, and we just need to give them some place to find. Also the idea of just going and asking people why they don't go to church and expecting a coherent answer from it. Today, if you knocked on somebody's door and asked them why they don't go to church, they probably look at you like you're from Mars or something. Like, why would a church? Who goes to church? It's just not part of the mental landscape. Whereas back then, it was essentially, people kind of knew, well, yeah, you should possibly go to church. So those were two strategies of the positive world. As we entered the neutral world, a third strategy came to the fore, which is cultural engagement. And this is a term that, again, the practitioners of this would happily embrace. They would say, yes, we practice cultural engagement. And I think there's a couple ways that we can think about the cultural engagement movement. One is that it's a sort of seeker sensitivity for the cities. So again, the cities were coming back. All these young millennial and Generation X college grads and businesses, they're pouring into the cities. There's a new urban sensibility, a new urban culture. And just as guys like Hybels and Rick Warren cracked the code on suburbia in the 1970s, this was about cracking the code on the urban environment. Okay, so they were not, so that's one of the things they were doing. And again, they adopted a variety of different styles. Some of them are much more formal and traditional, liturgical. Others are more hip, cool, contemporary arts forward. But they found styles that worked in the cities. And again, they adopted this therapeutic language to be able to reach them. And you can think of this as a seeker sensitivity for the city. Another way to think of it is as the opposite of the culture war. It's like the culture war, people wanted to fight against the culture. These people are like, let's not fight, let's sit down and talk. Let's try to get along with the culture. And again, these people were starting to develop, as it was becoming clear the culture war strategy was a loser, it wasn't going to work. and they're in places that are not friendly to the culture war. And it's like, why should we just fruitlessly fight with people? Why don't we take advantage of this new pluralistic landscape and just sit down and talk with people? And if we articulate the truths of Christianity in a compelling way, in language that they're prepared to understand, right? In ways that affirm the things that, we can affirm in that culture, that's the seeker sensitivity aspect, then maybe we can get a hearing for Christianity. And it did work for parts of it. So again, as I said, they came in and they rather than being negative towards this culture, they're like, look, there's a lot we like about the city. We love the arts. We like the life of the mind. We like being urban. We care about profession and vocation and things of that nature. And the other thing that they did that was the opposite of the culture war is that they were typically studiously apolitical. They're like, we don't do politics. And again, evangelical, sort of stereotyped as very conservative. These cities are much more progressive. They're like, we don't do politics. Although this sort of broke down a bit in 2016 with the Trump nomination, when a number of these people, really denounced him. They really sort of became essentially the never-Trumpers. Not all of them, but some of them. And there was, though, I would say, a political manifestation of the cultural engagement model, which you can see in a character like George W. Bush. The fact that the left called him Bush Hitler and all this stuff, that they hated him, we shouldn't let that obscure the extent to which he really was very different from the culture war evangelicals. What did he tout? His catchphrase was compassionate conservatism. He wanted to have a kinder, gentler conservatism. He made a point of saying explicitly, he said, basically it's almost like a literal quote, I'm not going to kick gays. We're not going to be anti-gay. He supported civil unions. He didn't support gay marriage, but he supported civil unions for gays. Less than a week after 9/11, he made the first ever presidential visit to a mosque in order to reassure Muslims that, hey, you're a valued part of America. We don't blame you for what happened. So this was very, very, very different than what you might have expected from a culture war type person. And but today I would say like the kind of the Platonic form of this cultural engagement leadership in politics is somebody like Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse. I think he really represents this. But again, the pastors and the self-consciously evangelical people, they tended to be very, very studiously apolitical. They didn't talk about politics up until Trump. And again, as I indicated, this is basically much more urban strategy. The people we associate this were much more urban. So you can think of who are these people? Tim Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian Church is probably the biggest and most influential name here. New York City. Hillsong Church, I would put in this category, very different, more the hip, cool category, but they did it. The Veritas Forum, if you're familiar with the Veritas Forum, literally started in the early 90s, goes to college campuses and invites a Christian person to sit down with a secular person and talk. I mean, it doesn't get any more cultural engagement than that. Contemporary artist Makoto Fujimura, if you know him, a writer Andy Crouch, these are people I would put in this cultural engagement bucket. So these three different movements, the culture war, the seeker sensitivity, and cultural engagement, they represented three strategies for dealing with sort of changing times. But I don't want to overly make you think like, I'm a consultant. I came from a management consulting background, as Pastor Wiley said. But I don't want you to think that a bunch of MBAs cooked these strategies up in the lab. Okay, this wasn't just a purely strategic model. There were also sort of other demographic, geographic, cultural, dispositional, theological differences between these groups that sort of drove a lot of what happened. From a geographic perspective, you could potentially say culture war was rural evangelicalism, seeker sensitivity was suburban evangelicalism, and cultural engagement was urban evangelicalism. Also, the culture warriors tended to have a sort of fundamentalist sensibility about them. And some of them actually came from fundamentalist backgrounds. The seeker sensitives and the cultural engagers had a more evangelical sensibility about them. So fundamentalism really prioritized doctrinal purity, and it was frequently separatist and hostile towards the culture or people that they felt would water down doctrine. Evangelicalism, or sometimes called neo-evangelicalism, started in the 1940s when people like Billy Graham and like that said, let's try to take the basic fundamentalist theology, but let's target the mainstream. Let's try to reach the mainstream of society. And it was much more, I would say, missional rather than doctrinal in focus. And so this division of what, again, sensibilities or sort of dispositions or ways of engaging with the world between sort of confessional or doctrinal purity on the one hand and revivalism or missional focus on the other, that's been a pervasive divide throughout American religious history. I think there were also other differences between these groups. You know, the culture warriors were mostly middle class or lower middle class. The leaders of the culture war movement were college educated, but most of the followers were not. Whereas the seeker sensitives and cultural engagers were much more solidly middle class or even upper middle class, much better educated. For example, if you go to a church in Manhattan, evangelical church in Manhattan, virtually the entire congregation is college degreed. That's not the case in a lot of places. The other thing is that the culture warriors attracted a lot of Pentecostals. There were a lot of charismatics in that movement. Pat Robertson, I think, was very influential in this, and there were some disagreements and some tensions, perhaps, between the Pentecostals and non-Pentecostals in that movement, but there was a big, heavy Pentecostal emphasis. Whereas in the seeker-sensitive and the cultural engagement world, they've tended to be much less Pentecostal, and the people who do sort of affirm the continuation of the spiritual gifts tend to be very low-key about it. The culture warriors were also very heavily shaped by the Cold War. They weren't just culture warriors, they were Cold Warriors. And again, we see this in something like Jerry Falwell's Liberty University. The very name sort of associates his theological project and his political project with America's fight against, again, godless communism. He didn't originally call it Liberty University. It was originally something else, and it was renamed to that. This was also an era, it emerged in this era in which there was tremendous end times fervor. The Soviet Union was supposed to be Gog and Magog, and we're going to have an imminent rapture or tribulation or all of the above. And there was sort of end times fever. There was books like The Late Great Planet Earth in the 70s selling millions of copies. And so that was really big. The cultural engagers, by contrast, they developed in a post-Cold War world. So they didn't really have any of this Cold War legacy about them. And they had not an end times perspective, but an end of history perspective. If you remember Francis Fukuyama's book, an article about that, which incidentally came out in the early 90s, right as this sort of neutral world was getting going. And so again, these strategies, culture war, seeker-sensitive, cultural engagement, they weren't just purely strategies. They were also different groups of people. But I do think that the particularities of their strategies and the way that they developed were linked directly to the eras in which they came about. Now, we have three worlds and three strategies. But two of the strategies are in the positive world and one's in the negative world, in the neutral world. But what's in the negative world? And the answer is there has not yet been an evangelical strategy to deal with the negative world. The one strategy that's been proposed for the negative world is Rod Dreher's Benedict option. If any of you read his book, The Benedict Option, that came out. Now, Dreher is Eastern Orthodox, formerly Catholic, and he may have underestimated he admits he doesn't know anything about evangelicalism. He'll tell you that straight up. And he may have underestimated how it might make some people throw up to have something named after like Catholic monks and things like that. But nevertheless, evangelicals basically rejected the Benedict option, and it wasn't really because there was too much Catholic imagery in it. It was really, I think, denial. People didn't want to admit that we're in this negative world. I think Christianity Today magazine commissioned 4 people to write about the Benedict option, and all 4 of them didn't like it for various reasons. And I think that's changing. I put together this Three Worlds framework and published originally a version of it in 2017. It was well received then. And then I sort of updated it, and it was published in First Things magazine earlier this year and got a huge response. But I was amazed that there are still people essentially denying that the negative world exists. For example, Tim Keller and David French implicitly did that when they sort of raised the objection, hey, Tim Keller said this, hey, when I went to New York, it was a hostile world. I was in the negative world when I went to New York. I was never in a neutral world. David French did the same thing, where he's sort of like, I know all these people who've been persecuted my entire adult life. So I call it, this is the argument that it's the same old negative world that it ever was. And so there's nothing new, implicitly, there's nothing new about today, where I think clearly we are in unprecedented times. You can just see what's going on, and when the skirmish line in the culture war is transgender athletes and girls' sports, you know something is really, really, really different in the country. And so there has been this state of denial, but again, I think it's changing. And again, we see this in the fact that evangelicals really have not developed their own strategy for the negative world. And I don't think there's going to be just one or just two. I think we're sort of in an exploration mode, trying to figure things out. But that's really the to-do. But as we've gone into the negative world, and these three models have been exposed to the pressures of the negative world, it has had big consequences for evangelicalism. It has caused a sort of adaptation or even deformation of some of these strategies. And of these groups, the cultural engagers clearly have the most at risk from the transition to the negative world. For one thing, the shift from a positive world to a neutral world represented a sort of downward slide in status for Christianity, but the cultural engagement strategy was much higher status than the culture war strategy, right? People like Tim Keller were treated as legitimate by secular society in a way that Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson never were. So, he can write for the New Yorker, he can write for the Atlantic. Nicholas Kristof does nice sit-downs with him in the New York Times. Actually, last weekend in the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition, there's a very nice profile in the review section with Tim Keller. He gets very friendly press in a way that these other guys, wouldn't have. So these people have a cultural status to lose that the culture warriors never had. And that doesn't mean they're all unwilling to lose it, but they actually do have something to lose. And by the way, they're also higher status than the seeker-sensitives because urban is higher status than suburban, basically. And so one of the example I like to give of the risk that's posed by the negative world to the cultural engagers was when Tim Keller went to Princeton Seminary in 2017. So Princeton Seminary is actually a mainline seminary. It's in the PCUSA. It's probably their flagship seminary, but it's not super liberal. I would say it's kind of moderate by PCUSA standards. A number of evangelical pastors have attended there. And they were going to give him their annual Abraham Kuyper Award and let him, give a talk there. Well, some of the students objected. They say he doesn't believe in ordaining women, so he's a bigot, he's this, he's that. And so they rescinded the award. They didn't give it to him, although they did let him give a talk. And I'm like, if Tim Keller is too much for a moderate mainline seminary, nobody else stands a chance, right, of getting a hearing, because he's the best at being able to navigate situations like this. Again, cultural engagers are also much more likely to live in sort of upscale urban environments, which are very, very secular progressive. They work in more higher paying, prestigious professions for mainstream employers. They love the social milieu of the upper middle class, the historic architecture, the pour over coffees, the farm to table restaurants, the luxury gyms, all of that stuff. I love that stuff too. Nothing wrong with that. But these are the environments in which the pressures of the negative world are most intense. This is where you're much more likely to get canceled. You're much more likely to get canceled if you work for Goldman Sachs in New York than if you work in a muffler shop in rural Indiana, where I'm from. You're just not you're gonna be exposed to different pressure. And so, I think that this pressure that they are under is often underappreciated by sort of red state Christians who, to them, it may be still the positive world to some extent where they live. And I think what's happened with the cultural engagers is a lot of them have sort of given up on the engagement, and they've sort of become synchronizers with the culture. And for example, they're becoming ever more vocal, ever more strident, ever more militant about issues like immigration or race. Refugees and racism, I say, are their two biggest issues. They're very loud on those issues, and virtually everything that they say today is a secular talking point, maybe with a little evangelical gloss, but there doesn't seem to be much genuinely Christian input on the circumstances. You know, they always sort of downplayed the flashpoint social issues like abortion or sexuality. They never really talked a lot about it. They tried to avoid talking about it. But today, they've actually even softened their stances on it further. So what you'll see is on abortion, you'll hear a lot of people talk about being holistically pro-life. So, you know, welfare for single mothers is a pro-life issue. Care for the refugees, a pro-life issue. And so they don't say that abortion's good necessarily, but they like to talk about other things as being pro-life. Similarly, on sexuality, you're much less likely to hear a sermon on traditional Christian moral teaching and much more likely to hear a lament about how the church has been unwelcoming to sexual minorities in the past. And they will use terms like sexual minorities that come from secular society. And so this group is sort of becoming much more in sync with secular progressive culture, I would say. Now, that's not all of them. Tim Keller, to his credit, has not done this. I think he stayed remarkably consistent on anything. In fact, you can actually argue that Keller, for those of you who know him, has actually gotten stronger on the conservative side on some issues. When he was a pastor, you can go Google like Tim Keller abortion. People would ask him about abortion. He'd sort of do a tap dance. You know, now if you look at his tweets, he will straight up say, the church, abortion's bad. I mean, he'll qualify, and say things like, yes, we need to care for moms and things like that, but he'll straight up say abortion is bad. I think on some of these things, he's actually more direct than he was in the past. But a lot of these guys are becoming very culturally synchronized. And I think for their part, the culture warriors, they've sort of evolved towards Trumpist populism. So they're Trumpist in a couple senses. One, they support Trump. And candidly, some of them support Trump to an unhealthy cult of personality degree. And they also support his sort of policies around, immigration, trade, or even post-liberal politics for people who kind of find out about that stuff. They're also populist because they attack the elites sort of in the name of the people. And I think they have also experienced some deformation as they have essentially jettisoned some of their traditional touchstones. The thing I really have in mind here is this idea that good character is a precondition to holding public office or some type of key position in society. You may remember, this was the issue at the Bill Clinton impeachment. They were like, Bill Clinton simply lacks the moral character to be president, period. Well, now these people all voted for Trump, and who's had all these affairs and he's done all these things. And it's like, wow, we can't let Hillary win, can we? And so I think there's sort of a realpolitik approach now that this group has sort of adopted. And so these sort of shifts in adaptations and deformations have produced sort of realignment and conflict for a few reasons. And one of them is that other than the kind of a few institutions that are like hardcore culture war or hardcore cultural engager, most churches, like these suburban megachurches, they contain a mix of people with a mix of dispositions. And these people are sort of being polarized by a couple of forces. One of them is Trump. The other is wokeness. And you could add a third to that, I guess, which is COVID, what to do about COVID. But I think the COVID one was less about creating the divisions than sort of exacerbating the divisions. But there are some people, especially a lot of these sort of people from affluent suburbs who are sort of Chamber of Commerce Republican types, they just couldn't go for Trump. They thought he was just low class, boorish character. Trump was just a bridge too far. And, for reasons of either they still do believe culture matters in leaders, or they just didn't like low class behavior. They just totally went insane about Trump. And then there are another group of people who, again, when the Great Awakening hit the world, it also hit the church. And a lot of churches have just become obsessed. Every sermon is about some element of racism. You practically hear in some of these things. I walked into a church the other month, and it was like, I practically sat through a Native American land acknowledgement at the beginning of the sermon. I'm like, what's going on here? And so a lot of people are very alarmed by that, and they're leaving churches. And so if you're somebody that's, the Trump issue and then the woke issue are really dividing people, causing a lot of divisions, causing a lot of realignments, and then you throw COVID on there, and it's really fuel on the fire. And again, it's increasingly acrimonious, increasingly the culture wars within the church. There's a lot of realignment happening. It's happening in the Republican Party as well, but it's also happening in the church. And so I think this has left evangelicalism in flux, and its kind of future is kind of up in the air, kind of in doubt. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we have not yet taken the measure of the negative world and said, now that we're here, what do we do? How do we live as individuals? How do we live as the church? How do we be on mission? How do we adapt to a world where the institutions of society do not look favorably on Christianity? That's a very difficult problem that I don't think anybody has figured out. But fortunately for us, that's the topic of this conference. And I'm very happy to hear Joe Rigney and James Wood tell us the solutions after I tell us the problems. So thank you very much.